From the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University.
Hi, I'm Bob Harrington from Stanford University, here on Medscape Cardiology and the Heart.org. Over the last couple of months of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's certainly been a lot of issues for the clinical cardiovascular community to talk about. But maybe one that's at the top of a lot of people's list is how do you get information that's reliable and timely out to the clinical and public health communities in a way that's both something that we can trust and a way something that we can use. I really have been thinking a lot about this as there's been a few issues with papers being retracted. There's been some issues with preprints not looking anything like the subsequent publications. And I thought it would be worthwhile to bring in two well-known senior investigators, clinicians, and editors from the cardiovascular journal world to have this discussion about things like how do you get this information out in a reliable but timely way? What do they think about preprints these days? How can they work with their editorial staff and their reviewers to ensure data integrity and a variety of other topics that I'm sure will come up. So I'm really pleased today to be joined by two friends and colleagues. First off, Nallamothu from Michigan, where he's a professor of internal medicine in the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine. And in this role, Brahmaji is with us today because he's the editor-in-chief of one of the circulation journals, Quality and Cardiovascular Outcomes. So Brahmaji, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Bob.
And also with us today is Clyde Yancy from Northwestern University. Clyde is the Division of Cardiology Chief at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine, where he's also a professor of medicine and the Vice Dean for Diversity in the School of Medicine. So Clyde, again, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. Happy to be here.
Oh, and I should note that Clyde's with us in his editorial role as the Deputy Editor of JAMA Cardiology. So that's the hat that I'm asking you to wear today, Clyde, amongst your many.
So I'm twice happy to be here then.
Okay. So let's start with the question that you heard me in the intro talking about. And maybe, Brahmaji, I'll start with you. How do you balance speed and reliability in a pandemic? I mean, as a clinician, as a scientist, I'm like anxious to hear, does this work? What are they observing in New York? What's happening in Italy? Do we have some early reports out of China? Because we're all having to make decisions about a disease we didn't know a whole lot about. And we're relying on, at least in part, the scientific publishing process to help us with that. So at the beginning, let's go back to March, April, when you first started seeing a lot of papers come in. How did you think about, as an editor-in-chief, those issues?
Well, you know, we struggled with a lot of the same things that I think you kind of highlighted. And very early on, right around like late February, actually, as our each one of our health systems and other types of schools and things like that we're thinking about this challenge, we took it on ourselves in the editorial team to start to think about this as well. We knew that A, this was going to be with us for a while, and B, that we were going to have an important role in terms of getting the science out there. And really there were three things that just come to mind. The first was we sat down as a team and we talked a lot, and we came out with the conclusion that first, kind of do no harm, which is we really thought that, with the role that scientific journals play in terms of disseminating high quality information, we had to be very careful about what we would push out there. And there's a great line that we oftentimes came back to as an editorial team, which is, there are no emergencies in pandemics. Right? That you want to be, it's like the old John Wooden quote, right? You want to be quick, but not, hurry. And I think we took that to heart. The second thing we did was we realized we didn't have a system that could operate with the current volume that we were starting to see. And so Mike Cohen, myself, Mike is the deputy editor. We do the triage of the manuscripts and stuff. And we quickly started to calibrate on the types of papers we would be interested in, what we could easily triage and stuff to really not burden our associate editors. And then, as you mentioned, the reviewers, who are an important part of the scientific community. And then I think the final thing I'll just say, because I'm kind of interested to hear what Dr. Yancy, what Clyde thought, and what they had come up with as well. But I think the third thing was we really wanted to know where could we make the most impact. And, each one of us has different expertises and scientific disciplines. And so we were really interested in trying to inform the outcomes research community in particular and trying to play a proactive role. So we wanted to really seek out those types of papers. And then once we got them, we wanted to kind of expedite those through the process. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up your last comment about impact, because I was really curious to have the two of you on representing two different types of journals. You're really going after, Ramaji, the subspecialty investigator community, the outcomes community, outcomes research community, health services research community. JAMA Cardiology is really going out for the broader clinical community. So it's interesting the way you phrase the impact question. I'll be interested to hear what Clyde has to say. Same question, Clyde. At the beginning, how did you start thinking about reliability versus speed? And what kind of conversations did you and the other editors of JAMA Cardiology have?
So, Bob, really, thank you for having this conversation, because I agree with you. The community is really curious about this, and there have to be lessons learned that we can carry forward. And Brahmaji, your comments are very familiar, because I think in every editorial room, virtual or otherwise, these sorts of thoughts were being distributed. But Bob, here was the single guiding ethos that impacted all of us as senior editors and as part of our brand equity. Can we be the trusted voice, and can we maintain that trust of the community? Truth is very important to us. And so the litmus test, particularly for all the senior editors, when we would see papers come in, is this true? That seems like a simple question, but as you know, Bob, sometimes there is a complexity in answering that question that requires a lot of thought, a lot of deliberation. But we believe that the equity that we have in the broader community is that we are a trusted voice. And no matter what the pace of information is, no matter how interesting, no matter how startling it is, we have to maintain that trust, because it takes a lot to get it and very little to lose it. And that was our guiding ethos. After we really recognized that we would not vary from our ethos, then we had to think about operationally, how do we do this? And I think this is the point in time where having experience amongst your senior leaders is so very important, particularly leaders that have experience internationally, specifically Bob Bannow. So Bob was in a unique position to actually know people that were in China executing the research. So much like Clyde Yancy and Bob Harrington on first-name basis, Bob Bannow and a number of investigators in China on first-name basis. And so that gave us a little bit of an inside edge, if you will. It took us one step closer to appreciating the integrity and executing the trust. But for us, it started with maintaining our commitment to being the trusted voice and searching for the truth, and then really relying on the most precious resource we have, which is the experience that comes from people that have been in the business 20, 30 years.
Both of you are sort of converging on some common themes here, and I'm wondering, I'll go to you first, Brahmaji. One of the issues that has certainly arisen in the last few months is how does one balance science and politics? The hydroxychloroquine story is an interesting one in that regard. And both of you have used the phrase trust, and sometimes people are trusting the non-scientists to deliver scientific information. Did you guys talk about that as an editorial board, about trying to separate science from the politics?
I think we tried to not directly think about that, particularly when we were evaluating science itself. But as you know, most journals publish things beyond just kind of original articles. We tried to publish, cardiovascular perspectives and other pieces that could influence the community. Very early on, actually, we had a paper that, a perspective that was talking about kind of, really warning how health systems were thinking about, COVID-19 and their responses to it. So I think we did get into that a little bit, but in terms of evaluating the science, I think we tried to separate the two. It's very challenging. I mean, you referenced a little bit the Ioannidis paper out of Stanford, and there was a lot of thoughts about that. And we tried to, as Clyde had said, we tried to learn from others as well as everyone started to kind of, go into this uncertain environment. I can tell you that in responses to lots of things that have happened over the last several months, we've tried to institute our own kind of, a more redundant system of review to be very careful about how we think about things. I'll say one last thing. I think, I really appreciated this job before, but the last 3 months, I've appreciated it even more. It is unbelievable in all the noise that's out there, how important it is for scientific journals to maintain integrity and trust, because they really are an important voice. And, it's for all its faults, we talk about peer review, and, sometimes peer review doesn't live up to perhaps the status that it's gotten in our communities, but I'll tell you, peer review has helped us shape a lot of science that we've published in the last few months and made it better. And I think that we just need to kind of hopefully rely on those types of systems in place.
Yeah, it's interesting. I often reference the Winston Churchill comment about democracy. It's the worst form of government except for all the others. And I think peer review might fall into that same category. It's the worst form of review except for all the alternatives, at least thus far what we've discovered. Clyde, I want to build on something Bremji said and go to you, which is trust. And I know a topic that you think a lot about, data integrity. And I want you to start thinking about it too, Bremji, because I want to come back to you in your investigator role and being able to pick out data that maybe hasn't emerged from a trustworthy source. There's issues with the data. Those things can be easy to pick up. They can be really difficult to pick up. And I think of the whole peer review publication process as it's like clinical research. There's this trust trail, and that each person and people doing the work, you have to trust them that they did the right thing. You must have talked about this at JAMA Cardiology, about trust and integrity.
Absolutely. But I'm smiling because Bremji said something that was so very tactful, a greater appreciation. Buddy, you worked your tail off. Let's just put it out there. But it was a labor of love, and we approached it as a duty, but being more focused on the question. Thankfully, there's triple redundancy within the walls of our organization, meaning that we've got senior editors, we have associate editors, and then we have statistical reviewers. And so that is a pretty robust clearinghouse to make it through to begin with, because recognize that we didn't have the time to send everything out for formal peer review. There were some COVID-19 papers that came exclusively to the associate editors and the editors, and we were turning decisions around within 24 hours. And so we were constantly getting new papers in our queue, exchanging ideas, and then doing our own fact checking and our own peer review of each other. So I really hope the community gives every journal a bit of license, because the processes that are in place were established in a very different era. And the idea of sending out peer review, even expecting it to come back within 72 hours, vetting it internally, you were days to weeks at your fastest speed. And there were some papers that came in that needed an even faster throughput than that. And so when everyone's working literally at warp speed, you and I talk about this warp phenomenon all the time now. But when we're working at what is fundamentally warp speed for editing and peer review, it's remarkable, Bob, that there weren't more mistakes made, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah, it really is. The journal publishing process in some regards relies on the slowness of the process to find the untruths and the problems. So, Bremji, let me go back to you. You're an outcomes investigator. I suspect you saw a lot of non-randomized data that were submitted to the journal. Important to make early observations in particular, maybe important to understand patterns of care, et cetera. You must have a special view towards thinking about data integrity, particularly in large data sets. I mean, it's not unusual now to see papers where people have used hundreds of thousands of subjects in some compilation of data that by which they're drawing their observations. How do you think about that? And what processes have you employed to try to understand, is this data reliable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I could make one comment just on what Clyde said though, before tackling that, just to give people like raw numbers, so typically in March, April, May, the AHA journals overall get about 5,500 submissions. And so just to put this in perspective, there were 8,500 or so in 2020. So again, I mean, just the relative increase, over a 50% increase. And then the second thing is that we haven't seen a drop, and about half of these papers are actually COVID-19, but a half of them are like other types of science in terms of that excess increase. So it's been really interesting to watch that through. Talking about your question about data integrity, it's so critical to go back to kind of what Clyde had said up front, that question of, is it true? Which is, so important. It's funny because in most editorial offices, there's two types of balances people will sometimes talk about. They'll say, is it true? And then, we all like to publish new and exciting findings. And so the question is it new, right? And, sometimes that tension that can kind of exist there as you start to really think about, what's important and what might not be important. So I'll say that, obviously there's a lot of studies that have been out there. The most prominent ones have been the Surgisphere related ones that have been recently retracted. We did a little thought exercise even internally. Like we were like, well, if we had gotten that paper, what would we have done? And, we're many ways away from the magnitude of like the Lancet and the New England Journal. But there were so many kinds of things that just popped up about it that just seemed inconsistent. We do see a lot of papers that rely on observational data, and I think that data integrity is one key aspect. But the bigger thing that we oftentimes run into is overstated claims about causal inferences, which is a big problem in our field. And again, I think we try to be very careful about that because when these papers do get published, then they go out into a broader audience. And, if we can't kind of police ourselves in terms of some of those issues, how can we expect, the media to kind of understand some of the nuances behind that? So those are really critical things. The last thing I'll say is one of the papers that we were super proud to publish early on was around just highlighting some of the opportunities to do better science. So the AHA actually put together a COVID-19 registry rather quickly as part of the Get With the Guidelines program. And so we highlighted some of that, and, we've actively sought out papers from groups that we think have the ability and access to some of these types of studies, similar to kind of what, Clyde had mentioned and stuff through Dr. Bono's connections as well. So.
Yeah, just to give you an idea of how fast the COVID registry moved, we got a request on a Friday from a group of investigators who were thinking about it. We had a phone call on Saturday, and on Monday, the team was working on it. Yes. So pandemics do cause organizations to move quickly. So,
but Bob, you just made a very good point, because the lessons we've learned through this pandemic tell us that we can move at a quicker pace with conventional publishing, that there are opportunities that we can capture to become more efficient, to actually be more timely in the dissemination of news. That has not always been the trademark of the scientific publishing community. And I think that's a lesson that we've learned. We've also learned how valuable peer review is. It's a precious resource. And like you, many of us are thinking about, is there another model? Is there a way that we can ascribe more value to the peer review process so that we can have more people capable of executing excellent peer review, engaging with journals? I don't know what that model would be right now, but it's a very important thought process to go through.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, I think that sometimes people underestimate both how hard, but also how rewarding being a peer reviewer can be. I actually enjoy reviewing articles. It gives me insight into what people are thinking about, gives you a chance to reflect on what a group outside of your own sort of bubble of investigators thinks about. So I hope that we can encourage more. I'm going to pivot a little bit, Clyde, to something that Brahmaji brought up, which is that while the volume that they've seen has gone up, it's not all COVID related. There's a lot of non-COVID related research coming in. Now, we could have a conversation about, does that mean everybody's sitting at home just writing all the papers they wanted to write? I suspect there is some truth to that, and we could have a longer conversation about that. But how's JAMA Cardiology dealing with the fact that, well, we need to learn things other than COVID related issues?
So the first thing we had to do was to increase the number of entry points. Traditionally, there was one entry point where Dr. Bono would do all of the primary triage. And that clearly became a non-starter because we had, as you say, the conventional papers coming in and then the rush of COVID-19 papers. And so we had to rotate, we had to elevate that triage responsibility amongst the group, but still the internal review process remained intact. But as well, I think when you've got very adroit senior editors and several of the people with whom I have the privilege to work are incredibly well-read themselves, there's a very quick study that can happen when a paper comes in and someone can know pretty quickly, is this novel? Is this new? Is this redundant? And make an immediate editorial decision. This is one of those circumstances where you want to be highly specific, not highly sensitive. You'd rather turn away something good at the risk of bringing something into the fold that did not have the time necessary to review to make certain it was true. And so I'm certain that we probably missed out on some papers we should have kept, but our bar was deliberately set high because we knew we were operating under stress and we had to be careful.
Two questions I want to try to finish with, and I'll say them both so you can both be thinking about your answers. One is going to be your current views of preprints, which have exploded during the last few months. And the second is a very serious topic that the pandemic has certainly revealed great health inequities and how your individual journals are thinking of that, because we have seen a flurry of papers addressing some important topics in that regard. So, Brahmanji, let me start with you for the first one, preprints.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that, just building off of what Clyde had just said about thinking of new models of how to disseminate science. I mean, preprints have been around now for a few years, mostly in kind of the hard and I'd say physical sciences up until recently. medRxiv was like timed perfectly for launching last year and then has just been inundated. Most of the preprints that are out there around COVID-19 have been hitting medRxiv. What's really interesting is I just want to make 2 points about that. One is medRxiv has a more complicated system than the other preprint servers that are in other types of sciences, like let's say physics, where you can't just post it and it's immediately posted. It goes through a review process. It's not, a review process that we would think about like a peer review process, but there's some quality checks that are done. And then what they've done that's really interesting is they've also done a check about making sure that they aren't posting things that are, highly suspect. Or really questionable. The last thing that medRxiv wants to do is have a preprint that's posted that's around something that's making a causal claim on a new treatment, leading to kind of like, conspiracy theories and things like that. So that's really been something that's a model that's taken off. And, I don't know how they're able to do it because of the volume of things they get, but I think to date stuff, they've tried really hard to do that. The second thing that's really interesting about preprints is there's a group that's just come out of, I think it's published by the Nature family, but it's called Rapid Reviews COVID-19 that's also using the preprint model. So what they do is they scour all the preprints that are posted using some AI technology to find those papers that would be of most great interest to the community. And then it's pulled together a group of volunteers who are willing to review these papers. And then it posts reviews up within like a week or so of the paper being printed on preprints. And, I've gone through some of these and it's quite interesting because the quality of the reviews are actually fairly good. And it gives folks an idea about, the quality of science kind of as a first pass. And what's really interesting to me is like kind of, journals are struggling a little bit, do we want to be newspapers? Do we want to be textbooks? Do we want to live somewhere in the middle? Because even if we publish something that might be true today, science has never been about getting into the end zone and spiking the ball, right? It's like one advance just leads to another. And I think having some of the humility to know that even things that we publish prospectively knowing it's the right thing to do might not turn out in the long term to be the right way in which science advances. So there's a lot out there, and I'll just end with those comments. So.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I try to explain to some of my friends outside of medicine. I said, well, you published that, and it turned out to be wrong. I said, well, that's science. I mean, things turn out to be wrong all the time. That's because, to your point, we're moving the ball down the field. We're not necessarily scoring. So I appreciate your comment. Preprints from your perspective, Clyde.
I'll make one comment about preprints. Bob, you and I have appreciated the fact, as have many others, that nothing beats the power of randomization. The next sentence, nothing beats the power of peer review. And so I think right now, that's the highest bar. There is a role for preprint service, and we're wrestling with that. And Brahmanji is right. particularly for the basic and physical sciences, where it really is a repository for preliminary data that other investigators can use in fundamental discovery. I think that's really very comforting and very appropriate. But we have to work through the rest of this process and understand if that's where clinical data should go that might be actionable. I think the second question that you raised, though, is a very important one, and I applaud you for bringing this up, because there are many in medicine that wrestle with the intersection of society and medicine. There is this vernacular phrase, that's not in our lane, that is in our lane, etc. But I think Bramji, again, gave me a very nice segue into this conversation when he mentioned the word humility. I think as senior editors, we have to have enough judgment to understand that biology doesn't explain every human condition that we treat and every circumstance we have to address in medicine, that there is an intersectionality of the life and living experience and the biological understanding that we promulgate. And if we don't appreciate that intersectionality, if we don't comment on that, if we don't inform our community as carefully and as truthfully as we can about these personal exigencies that impact health and disease, then we haven't executed our job. If our job is to maintain the flow of information about health and disease, we have to appreciate all of the tethers that influence health and disease. It takes courage to go into this space because it very quickly gets into societal arguments. It very quickly gets into public policy arguments, but I want to close with this thought. It was a brilliant line that was published by William Owen in JAMA talking about the healthcare disparities that were exposed by COVID-19. He made it very clear. We've learned from COVID-19 that all policy is health policy because there's an impact on life and living that ultimately becomes manifest as a clinical circumstance. So I think these kinds of statements are so very powerful. And I'm pleased that the editing community has accepted the challenge to foray into this intersectionality of the life and living experience in science.
You know, one of the great tragedies of this was in the 20th century was the separation of schools of medicine and schools of public health, because in fact they're so intertwined, as you've said. Yes, there is the clinical medicine piece, but that's part of a bigger public health set of issues. And we need to do more to bring those two together to try to answer questions. As you know well, Clyde, that the whole focus and increasing focus on the social determinants of health, critically important. But I think we're starting to even move beyond that into things like systemic and structural racism and the effect that they have on the public health. So, Clyde, one of the best papers I read the last few months was yours in JAMA, your viewpoint. So stay out of your lane, and because it helps inform the rest of us. Bramji, as I turn from Clyde to you, I want to ask the same question around health equity, around racism. What have you thought about with your editorial group? And have you had the conversation about, to use Clyde's phrase, what is going to be your lane for your journal? Is it going to be one that includes these public health issues, these social issues, maybe a different type of science, including social science? I would think that an outcomes journal is perfect for some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's a huge land grab, but we've always thought of those issues as being well within the role of the journal and stuff. I mean, you can go back and I love this like historical discussion about, the schools of medicine and the schools of public health. I mean, like you could go back to Rudolf Virchow, right? And the ideas that he had about the connections between politics and medicine. So we absolutely consider many of these things. I mean, I think that what's been really sad about the whole issue with COVID-19 is how it's shown the stresses and the breakpoints within our healthcare systems and how it's affected, vulnerable populations. So we are all in with these things. I mean, we just published a recent statement on housing and its impact on health, which we feel, again, is starting to get into these other areas. If we really want to make our patients better, I think we have to think more broadly than just in the moment when they're in front of you in clinic. And And many of these are, as you alluded to, structural issues. Tough answers and tough problems, and I think really things that we have to kind of come together as. But I can tell you absolutely circulation, cardiovascular quality and outcomes wants to be a voice in that discussion. And we want to be a voice that can hopefully influence it in a way that's positive.
Great. I thank you. And thank you both, actually. I can't imagine having had a better discussion about publishing during a pandemic with my two colleagues, Dr. Nallamothu and Dr. Yancy from Michigan and Northwestern, respectively. Thank you to the listeners for joining us here on Medscape Cardiology and theheart.org. And again, terrific job, Clyde and Brahmaji. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.